Case 1. Teresa Lewis, the woman who smiled at the wrong moment. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a courtroom when a verdict is read and the person it concerns does not cry. They do not collapse. They do not gasp. They simply sit there, expression unreadable, as though the words being spoken have nothing to do with them at all. That was Teresa Lewis on the day her fate was sealed. And it was that stillness, more than any evidence, more than any testimony, that many people in that room said they never forgot. Was it shock? Was it acceptance? Or was it something else entirely, the composure of a woman who had already calculated every angle and simply found, for once, that the numbers did not add up in her favor? Teresa Lewis was born on April 26, 1969, in Danville, Virginia. By most accounts, her early life was unremarkable in the saddest possible way, marked not by dramatic trauma, but by quiet limitation. She struggled academically and was assessed in later years as having below-average intellectual functioning, with an IQ reported at around 72. She married young, and by the time she was in her early 30s, she had found herself in a second marriage to a man named Julian Lewis, a factory worker and Army veteran with a life insurance policy worth approximately $250,000. It was that policy and the quiet, ordinary life that surrounded it that would become the center of one of Virginia's most debated capital cases. In October 2002, Teresa Lewis set a plan in motion. She had been involved with two men, Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller, and investigators would later establish that she had recruited both of them to carry out the shooting of her husband Julian and his son Charles Lewis, her stepson, inside their home in Pittsylvania County. The motive was straightforward and devastating in its coldness. With Julian and Charles gone, Teresa stood to collect on the insurance policy. On the night of October 30th, 2002, both Julian and Charles Lewis were shot inside the family home. Julian died the following morning. Charles died 2 days later. Teresa Lewis called 911 that night, crying and screaming into the phone. Investigators, however, quickly found the seams in her story. Her behavior in the days following the attack drew immediate suspicion. She was seen purchasing items at Walmart in the early hours of the morning, shortly after the incident. Cell phone records placed her in contact with the two shooters. And crucially, investigators discovered that Teresa had taken out additional insurance policies on Julian just months before his death and had named herself the sole beneficiary. When detectives began to pull at those threads, the entire fabric of her story unraveled. Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller were arrested, and both agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. Each received life sentences. Teresa Lewis, as the architect of the plan, was charged with capital murder. The trial drew significant attention, not just because of the nature of the crime, but because of the question that hung over the entire proceedings. Was Teresa Lewis the manipulative mastermind prosecutors described? Or was she a woman of limited intelligence who had been used by others? Her defense attorneys argued strenuously that Schallenberger was the true driving force behind the murders, and that Teresa, with her low IQ, had been manipulated rather than the other way around. Adding weight to that argument, Schallenberger himself reportedly wrote a letter from prison, claiming that he had manipulated Teresa for financial gain. The letter emerged after her conviction, and it became a cornerstone of the appeals that followed. Prosecutors countered that the evidence told a different story, that Teresa had initiated contact with the shooters, had provided the weapons, and had left the back door unlocked on the night of the attack. The jury convicted Teresa Lewis of capital murder. The judge sentenced her to death. What followed was 8 years of appeals, petitions, and public debate about whether the death penalty was appropriate for a woman of her intellectual level. Advocacy groups argued that executing someone with an IQ of 72 raised profound moral and legal questions. The case attracted international attention. Then President of the European Union and several foreign governments formally appealed to Virginia's governor to grant clemency. A bipartisan group of former prosecutors and legal scholars submitted letters urging a reconsideration of the sentence. Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell reviewed the case and denied clemency. He stated that the evidence clearly showed Teresa Lewis as the head of this particular criminal enterprise. On October 22, 2010, Teresa Lewis was executed by lethal injection at the Greensville Correctional Center in Jarrett, Virginia. She was the first woman executed in Virginia in nearly 100 years, and the first woman executed in the United States in 5 years. In her final statement, she addressed the families of Julian and Charles Lewis directly. She said she was sorry for the pain she had caused and asked for their forgiveness. She also told her own family that she loved them. Then she closed her eyes. At 9:02 in the evening, Teresa Lewis was pronounced dead. She was 41 years old. What lingers about the Teresa Lewis case is not simply the crime, it is the unresolved question at its heart. 2 men who pulled the triggers received life in prison. The woman convicted of planning it all received death. Whether that outcome reflected justice, or whether it reflected something more complicated about how the law weighs culpability and intellect, remains a matter of genuine debate. What is not debated is the cost. 2 men died in their own home, a family was shattered, and the machinery of justice ground forward to its conclusion, leaving behind a silence not entirely unlike the one Teresa Lewis wore on the day her verdict was read. If Teresa Lewis planned her way into history with cold calculation, the next woman on our list did something eerily similar, but in a case so brazen, so publicly documented, that it would shock an entire nation and change the way America looked at crime, marriage, and the deadly power of desire. Case 2. Ruth Snyder. The photograph that changed everything. Most people, when they think about the moments that define them, imagine something private, a decision made alone, a choice no one else will ever fully understand. Ruth Snyder did not get that luxury. The moment that defined her was captured on film, published on the front page of the New York Daily News, and seen by millions of people across the United States the morning after it happened. It was a photograph of her dying, strapped to the electric chair at Sing Sing prison, the current already passing through her body. It remains one of the most controversial and debated press photographs in American history. But long before that photograph was taken, there was a story, one of ambition, deception, and a marriage that had curdled into something neither party could escape. Ruth Snyder was born Ruth Brown on March 27, 1895, in New York City. She grew up in Queens, and by her early 20s, had settled into a life that looked, from the outside, entirely conventional. She worked as a telephone operator, married a man named Albert Snyder, an art editor for a boating magazine, and had a daughter named Lorraine. The Snyders lived in a respectable home in Queens Village. To their neighbors, they were an ordinary couple, leading an ordinary life. But behind that facade, the marriage was deeply unhappy. Albert Snyder was described by those who knew him as cold and emotionally distant. He reportedly kept a photograph of a former fiancée, Jessie Guichard, who had died before they married, hanging in the house, a constant and silent presence that Ruth deeply resented. In 1925, Ruth Snyder met a corset salesman named Henry Judd Gray at a Manhattan restaurant, and the two began an affair. Gray was mild-mannered and, by most accounts, easily led qualities that would prove significant as the relationship deepened. Ruth, who had a commanding personality that multiple people described as forceful and calculating, soon began speaking to Gray about her husband. The conversations moved from complaint to contemplation to planning. Over the course of several months, Ruth made at least 7 attempts to end her husband's life, including tampering with his car, leaving the gas on while he slept, and administering chloroform. All 7 failed. Albert Snyder, apparently oblivious, survived each attempt without connecting them to his wife. On the night of March 19, 1927, Ruth Snyder and Judd Gray entered the Queens Village home together while Albert slept. What followed resulted in Albert Snyder's death. The scene was staged to look like a burglary. Ruth had arranged it so that she appeared to be tied up and left behind by an intruder. She called her daughter's name until the child found her and summoned help. When police arrived, Ruth told them a large Italian man had broken into the house. Detectives, however, were immediately skeptical. The staging was too deliberate. The rope around Ruth's wrists was too loose. Albert had been hit with a sash weight, strangled, and suffocated with chloroform-soaked rags, a level of sustained effort that did not suggest a panicked intruder. Investigators searched the house and found a tie pin engraved with the initials J.G. They traced it to Judd Gray. Under questioning, Gray crumbled almost immediately and confessed, implicating Ruth. Ruth, confronted with Gray's confession, then offered her own version of events, attempting to shift the greater blame onto her lover. The two trials held separately, but in the same courthouse became a national sensation. Reporters from across the country descended on the Queens County Court. The public could not get enough. Ruth Snyder was portrayed in the press as a cold, manipulative woman who had seduced a weak man into doing her bidding. She was called the Granite Woman and the Dumb Dora in competing headlines. The coverage was lurid, relentless, and deeply gendered, but it also reflected a genuine public fascination with the case. Both Ruth Snyder and Judd Gray were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Their appeals were denied. On January 12, 1928, both were executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. A reporter for the Chicago Tribune, Tom Howard, had smuggled a small camera strapped to his ankle into the execution chamber. At the moment the current was applied to Ruth Snyder's body, he lifted his trouser leg and pressed the shutter. The resulting photograph, blurry, stark, and deeply disturbing, was published the following morning on the front page of the New York Daily News. It caused an immediate uproar. Debates about press ethics, capital punishment, and the public's right to witness state executions raged for months afterward. Ruth Snyder's final words, spoken in the execution chamber, were reported as a brief prayer and an expression of sorrow. She reportedly said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," a phrase attributed to Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, though accounts vary on whether she spoke these words aloud or whispered them. She was 32 years old when she died. Judd Gray was executed later the same evening. He was 36. What the Ruth Snyder case revealed was not simply the danger of a loveless marriage or the recklessness of an affair. It revealed how thoroughly the public wanted to see a certain kind of woman punished and how willingly the press obliged. Her image, captured in that stolen photograph, became a symbol not just of her own fate, but of a society working out its deepest anxieties about women, power, and transgression. From the tabloid sensation of 1928, we move forward in time, but not far from the same dark territory of love, jealousy, and a moment of violence that could never be undone. Case 3. Wanda Jean Allen. The case nobody wanted to look at closely. There are cases that the justice system processes quickly, efficiently, and without much public debate, and then, years later, people begin to look back and ask uncomfortable questions. The case of Wanda Jean Allen is one of those. On the surface, it appeared straightforward. A woman with a prior criminal history had shot and killed her girlfriend outside a police station in Oklahoma City. She was arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. But beneath that surface lay a tangle of questions about intellectual disability, inadequate legal representation, race, and whether the process that condemned Wanda Jean Allen had truly been as thorough as it needed to be. Wanda Jean Allen was born on September 22, 1959, in Oklahoma. Her early life was marked by hardship, and she was assessed at various points as having significant cognitive limitations. Her IQ was later estimated to fall in a range consistent with intellectual disability. In 1981, she was involved in the shooting death of a friend named Dedra Pettus. She claimed it was accidental. She pleaded guilty to a manslaughter charge and received a suspended sentence and probation. That prior incident would prove enormously consequential to everything that followed. By the mid-1980s, Wanda Jean Allen was in a relationship with a woman named Gloria Leathers. The relationship was volatile and troubled, documented by multiple calls to law enforcement over domestic disputes. On December 1, 1988, a confrontation between the two women escalated outside the village police department in Oklahoma City. During the encounter, Wanda Jean Allen shot and killed Gloria Leathers. She was 30 years old. The location outside a police station meant that officers were present within moments. Wanda Jean Allen was taken into custody immediately. At trial, the prosecution presented a straightforward case of deliberate violence. The prior manslaughter conviction involving Dedra Pettus was introduced and weighed heavily against her, painting a picture of a repeat offender with a pattern of deadly behavior. The jury convicted Wanda Jean Allen of first-degree murder and sentenced her to death. The proceedings lasted a relatively short time, and the legal representation she received drew significant criticism in the years that followed. Her trial attorney, who was later disbarred for unrelated conduct, reportedly failed to investigate or present evidence of her intellectual disability to the jury, a fact that advocates argued could and should have affected her sentence. What emerged in the years between her conviction and her execution was a growing body of concern from legal scholars, civil rights organizations, and mental health professionals. Groups pointed out that Wanda Jean Allen had an IQ that placed her in the range of intellectual disability, and argued that executing someone with those cognitive limitations raised serious constitutional questions, particularly in light of later Supreme Court decisions that would address the execution of intellectually disabled individuals. Her case also drew attention because of her identity. She was a black woman, and advocates noted that the intersection of race, gender, sexual orientation, and intellectual capacity had created a compounded vulnerability in the way her case had been handled. Appeals were filed, reviewed, and ultimately denied. The courts, examining the procedural record, did not find sufficient grounds to overturn the conviction or the sentence. On January 11, 2001, Wanda Jean Allen was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. She was 41 years old. She became the first black woman executed in the United States since 1954. In her final statement, she spoke of her faith and said, "I love you, Gloria," a direct address to the woman she had killed. Whether those words reflected genuine remorse, complicated grief, or the unresolved emotional wreckage of a volatile relationship that had ended in the worst possible way, no one could say for certain. She closed her statement with a prayer. The case of Wanda Jean Allen did not generate the kind of national headlines that some others on this list produced. There was no celebrity involvement, no tabloid love triangle, no stolen photograph. There was simply a woman limited in ways the system arguably never fully reckoned with, who had arrived at an irreversible moment outside a police station in Oklahoma City, and who had carried the consequences of that moment for the rest of her life. Some crimes are committed in the heat of an instant. Others are planned with a patience that is, in its own way, more disturbing than any impulsive act. The next case belongs firmly in the second category, and what investigators found buried in a backyard in Texas left even seasoned detectives struggling to find the right words. Case 4. Betty Lou Beets. What the garden was hiding. There is something about the word backyard that carries with it an assumption of safety, of ordinary life, of children playing, of summer evenings, and the smell of cut grass. When investigators arrived at the property of Betty Lou Beets on Lake Palestine in Texas in 1985, they had a warrant, a tip, and a growing sense of unease. What they found beneath the surface of that ordinary-looking yard would rewrite everything anyone thought they knew about the quiet, soft-spoken woman who lived there, and it would raise a question that prosecutors, defense attorneys, and jurors would wrestle with for years. How does a person become capable of this? Betty Lou Beets was born on March 12, 1937, in Roxborough, North Carolina. Her life story, as it emerged during trial proceedings, was one of sustained and serious hardship. She was reportedly subjected to abuse in childhood, lost significant hearing in both ears due to an assault, and moved through a succession of troubled relationships. She married multiple times, 6 in total, by most accounts, and several of those marriages ended badly. By the time she arrived in Texas and settled near Lake Palestine, she had already lived several lifetimes' worth of difficulty. To her neighbors, she was a pleasant, grandmotherly woman who lived quietly near the water. Her 5th husband, Jimmy Don Beets, a Dallas firefighter, disappeared in August 1983. Betty Lou told people he had gone out on the boat and drowned, that the body had never been recovered. She collected on his life insurance policy and continued living in the home. 2 years passed. Then, a tip reached investigators, and they obtained a search warrant for the property. On August 6, 1985, they began to excavate. Beneath a storage structure known as a wishing well on the property, they found the body of Jimmy Don Beets, shot twice with a .22 caliber weapon. And that was not all. Elsewhere on the property, buried in a sleeping bag, was the body of another man, Doyle Wayne Barker, Betty Lou's 4th husband, who had also supposedly disappeared years earlier. 2 husbands, both shot, both buried on the same property, both insured. The investigation that followed was extensive and methodical. Betty Lou's son, Robert Branson, and her daughter, Robbie Barker, became central figures in the case, and their cooperation with investigators, and later their testimony, proved decisive. Prosecutors argued that Betty Lou Beets had killed both men in a calculated scheme to collect insurance money, and that the pattern of behavior demonstrated a deliberate and cold-blooded approach to solving the problem of unwanted husbands. The defense presented a very different portrait, a woman who had been physically and emotionally brutalized across decades of abusive relationships and who had reached a breaking point. Her attorneys argued that a history of abuse, including what she described as severe mistreatment at the hands of Jimmy Don Beets, had shaped her actions in ways the jury needed to consider. The jury convicted Betty Lou Beets of capital murder in the death of Jimmy Don Beets. She was sentenced to death. Her case attracted significant attention from women's advocacy groups and from people who argued that the role of domestic abuse in cases involving women who harm their abusers was systematically underweighted by the justice system. Former President Jimmy Carter was among those who called for clemency, citing concerns about the consideration given to her history as a survivor of abuse. Texas Governor George W. Bush, then in the final months of his governorship, reviewed the case and declined to intervene. Betty Lou Beets was executed by lethal injection at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, on February 24, 2000. She was 62 years old, making her one of the oldest women executed in the modern era of American capital punishment. In her final statement, she did not express remorse. Instead, she addressed what she described as the corruption and injustice of the process that had brought her to that moment, and she said goodbye to her children and grandchildren. She closed by saying she was going to a place where there was no more pain. The case of Betty Lou Beets sits at a painful intersection, the intersection of genuine criminal culpability and genuine victimhood. Those two things are not always mutually exclusive, and the discomfort of holding both truths at once is part of what makes this case so difficult to resolve, even now, more than 2 decades after her death. If Betty Lou Beets represents the tragedy of what long-term suffering can produce, the next case on our list is something altogether more difficult to contextualize: a crime so extreme in its nature that it challenged the capacity of ordinary language to describe it, and left an entire community asking how the world it thought it understood could contain real crimes, untold secrets, unfiltered truth. Subscribe to our channel. It's completely free because some stories were never meant to stay buried. Help us grow and bring you more powerful documentaries just like this one. Case 5. Lisa Montgomery, the town that could not forget. There are crimes that shock, and then there are crimes that shatter. The difference is not merely one of severity, it is one of imagination. Most people, hearing about a violent act, can construct some frame of understanding around it, some context that helps the mind process what happened. The crime that Lisa Montgomery committed in December 2004 did not offer that comfort. It defied easy framing. It overwhelmed context. It left the small town of Skidmore, Missouri, permanently altered, and it forced a national conversation about the nature of evil, the failure of mental health systems, and whether the law could adequately reckon with a human mind broken beyond most people's ability to comprehend. Lisa Montgomery was born on February 27, 1968, in DeMonte, Kansas. The details of her early life that emerged during her trial and in subsequent investigations were almost unbearable in their accumulation. She was reportedly subjected to severe and prolonged abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual, from early childhood. Multiple mental health professionals who examined her over the years documented diagnoses, including complex post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative disorder, and other serious conditions. Her childhood, by the accounts that emerged in court proceedings, had been a sustained experience of harm inflicted by the adults who were supposed to protect her. She married at 18, had 4 children, and later divorced. A second marriage followed. By 2004, she was living in Kansas and had told people around her, including her husband, that she was pregnant. She was not pregnant, but she desperately, catastrophically wanted to be. In December 2004, Lisa Montgomery had made contact online with Bobby Jo Stinnett, a 23-year-old woman in Skidmore, Missouri who bred rat terriers and who was 8 months pregnant with her first child. The two communicated through a dog breeding forum and arranged for Lisa to visit Bobby Joe's home on December 16, 2004, purportedly to purchase a puppy. What followed resulted in Bobby Joe Stinnett's death and the removal of her unborn daughter from her womb. Lisa Montgomery left the home carrying the baby, whom she presented to her husband and community as her own newborn child. The investigation moved with remarkable speed. Law enforcement traced the online communications to Lisa Montgomery within 24 hours. She was arrested on December 17, 2004, in Melvin, Kansas, with the infant who was alive and unharmed in her possession. The baby was returned to her father, Zeb Stinnett, and named Victoria Joe. She survived and is alive today. Lisa Montgomery was charged with federal kidnapping, resulting in death, a capital offense. Her trial, held in federal court in Kansas City, Missouri in 2007, lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution presented the online communications, the forensic evidence, and the testimony of law enforcement and medical experts. The defense focused intensively on Lisa Montgomery's mental state, presenting extensive evidence of her history of trauma and her documented psychiatric conditions. Mental health experts testified that her actions were the product of a profoundly damaged mind operating outside the bounds of rational decision-making. Prosecutors argued that the planning and execution of the crime, the online contact, the arranged visit, the items she brought to Stinnett's home demonstrated a degree of premeditation that the law required the jury to confront. The jury convicted Lisa Montgomery and sentenced her to death. Years of appeals followed, centering significantly on the question of her mental competency and whether the defense presented at trial had been adequate. In January 2021, in the final days of the Trump administration, multiple federal courts and the Supreme Court weighed in as execution dates were set and contested. On January 13, 2021, Lisa Montgomery was executed by lethal injection at the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana. She was 52 years old and became the first woman executed by the federal government in nearly 70 years. Her final words were not publicly reported. Victoria Joe Stinnett, the child at the center of the case, was 16 years old on the day Lisa Montgomery died. No transition can adequately bridge the distance between a case like this and the one that follows. But the story of Kelly Gissendaner reminds us that the road to an execution chamber is rarely straight, and that the journey of a human being between crime and consequence can contain transformations that the law, by its nature, is not always equipped to weigh. Case 6. Kelly Gissendaner, the theologian on death row. She studied theology in prison. She led worship services for other inmates. She corresponded with one of Europe's most respected philosophers of religion, a man named Jürgen Habermas, who later described her transformation as authentic and profound. She wrote letters, mentored women, and spent years trying, in whatever way was available to her, to become something better than what she had been on the night of February 7, 1997. None of it was enough to save her life, but it was enough, depending on who you ask, to complicate the question of what her death was actually meant to accomplish. Kelly Gissendaner was born on August 21, 1965, in Georgia. Her early life included a difficult family background, marked by instability and, by her own account, a persistent search for love and security that led her into relationships that were not good for her. She married Douglas Gissendaner, and the two had 3 children together. By the mid-1990s, the marriage was in serious trouble. Kelly had begun an affair with a man named Gregory Owen. According to prosecutors, she then began planning to have her husband killed so that she could collect on his life insurance and be free to pursue her relationship with Owen. On the night of February 7, 1997, while Kelly was elsewhere establishing an alibi, Gregory Owen confronted Douglas Gissendaner outside his home in Gwinnett County, Georgia. Douglas Gissendaner was killed. Owen then drove Douglas's car to a remote location and set it on fire. Investigators pieced together what had happened through physical evidence and, crucially, through Gregory Owen's own cooperation. Owen agreed to testify against Kelly in exchange for a sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole. Kelly Gissendaner was charged with murder and tried in 1997. The jury convicted her and sentenced her to death. Owen, the man who carried out the killing, would not face execution. That asymmetry, the person who planned the crime receiving death, while the person who committed the physical act received a lesser sentence, became one of the central arguments in the long campaign to spare Kelly Gisendina's life. Her attorneys, supporters, and eventually a significant segment of the public argued that this disparity was fundamentally unjust. They also argued, with increasing urgency as the years passed, that Kelly Gisendina was no longer the person who had planned her husband's death. The theological transformation she underwent in prison was documented, genuine, and witnessed by people with no particular reason to advocate for her. Pope Francis sent a personal letter requesting clemency. Over 100,000 people signed petitions. Former prison wardens, people whose professional lives had been spent overseeing executions, wrote to the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles, urging them to reconsider. The board denied clemency twice. Execution dates were set and postponed once because the lethal injection drugs were found to be cloudy and their safety could not be confirmed, a delay that drew its own controversy. On September 30th, 2015, Kelly Gisendina was executed by lethal injection at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison in Jackson. She was 47 years old. Her final words were remarkable. She sang. Standing at the threshold of death, Kelly Gisendina sang the hymn, Amazing Grace, her voice reportedly filling the execution chamber until the end. Her children, who had lost their father to her planning and their mother to the consequences of it, were left to carry both losses forward. The case of Kelly Gisendina does not resolve neatly. It does not offer the kind of clean moral clarity that people often seek in true crime stories. What it offers instead is a harder thing, a genuine question about whether transformation matters, whether it should matter, and what exactly society intends to accomplish when it insists that it does not. From a case defined by its final moment of grace, we turn now to a woman whose story also involves transformation, but whose path to that transformation ran through a darkness so wide and so deep that it took years for anyone to understand the full extent of what she had done. Case 7. Velma Barfield, the woman who baked them pie. She was a grandmother. She wore house dresses and reading glasses. She went to church. She baked for her neighbors and spoke softly and seemed, to almost everyone who knew her, to be exactly what she appeared to be, a kind, aging Southern woman navigating the ordinary difficulties of later life. The gap between that appearance and the reality of what Velma Barfield had done over the course of nearly a decade was so wide that investigators, when they first began to grasp the full picture, I found it genuinely difficult to reconcile the two. Because Velma Barfield had not acted in a single moment of rage or grief, she had acted repeatedly, methodically, and quietly in kitchens, in cups of coffee, in plates of food passed across tables to people who trusted her completely. Velma Barfield was born Margie Velma Bullard on October 29, 1932, in South Carolina, and grew up in rural North Carolina. Her early life was shaped by poverty and, by her own account, by a difficult relationship with her father that left lasting emotional wounds. She married Thomas Burke in her late teens, and the two had 2 children. Burke died in a house fire in 1969, a death that was ruled accidental at the time, but would be examined more closely after subsequent events came to light. Velma remarried to a man named Jennings Barfield, who died in 1971. That death, too, was attributed to natural causes. In the years that followed, Velma Barfield struggled significantly with prescription drug dependency, a problem that had developed following medical treatment and that came to define much of her daily life. She stole money to fund her dependency from family members, from the elderly people she sometimes cared for, and it was the need to cover up those thefts that investigators would later conclude drove her to poison at least some of her victims. In 1974, she poisoned her own mother, Lillian Bullard, who died after a sudden illness. In 1977, she poisoned Montgomery Edwards and Dolly Edwards, an elderly couple she was caring for, both of whom died. In 1978, she poisoned her boyfriend Stuart Taylor, who died in January of that year after a prolonged illness. It was Taylor's death that finally broke the case open. His family requested an autopsy, and toxicological testing revealed the presence of arsenic in his system. Investigators contacted Velma Barfield. She initially denied involvement, but then, In a conversation that investigators described as sudden and unexpected, she confessed not only to poisoning Stuart Taylor, but to poisoning the others as well. She claimed that she had not intended to kill any of them, that she had administered small amounts of poison to make them sick enough to divert attention from the financial thefts she had committed, and that the deaths had not been her intention. Whether that account was true, or whether it was a framing designed to soften what she had done, was something the jury would have to weigh. Velma Barfield was tried for the murder of Stuart Taylor and convicted of first-degree murder in November 1978. She was sentenced to death. During her years on death row, she became a born-again Christian and was, by all accounts, a changed and deeply remorseful woman. Her case attracted significant advocacy, including support from the evangelist Billy Graham's daughter Anne Graham Lotz, who visited her in prison and attested to the sincerity of her faith. Her execution became a political issue during the 1984 North Carolina gubernatorial race, and the incumbent governor, Jim Hunt, who was running for Senate, declined to grant clemency, a decision his opponent used against him in campaign advertising. On November 2, 1984, Velma Barfield was executed by lethal injection at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. She was 52 years old. She became the first woman executed in the United States since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976, and the first woman executed by lethal injection in American history. She chose her final meal, cheese doodles and a Coca-Cola. In her final statement, she expressed remorse to the family of Stuart Taylor and to all those her actions had hurt. She said she hoped her death would in some small way bring peace to those she had wronged. She died quietly. Some acts of harm are premeditated and prolonged. Others happen in a single, irreversible night, born from a darkness so private that even those closest to the person responsible could not see it coming. The next case belongs to the second kind, and it is one of the most painful on this entire list. Case 8, Christina Riggs. The night she could not be stopped. There are crimes that produce anger, and there are crimes that produce grief, and there are crimes that produce a grief so total and so suffocating that anger cannot find a foothold inside it. The case of Christina Riggs belongs to the last category. What she did on the night of November 4th, 1997, in her apartment in Sherwood, Arkansas, is something that people who followed the case closely say they have never entirely been able to file away, never been able to put in a box labeled "understood" and close the lid on, because the victims were her own children, and because every piece of evidence suggested that she had not acted in a moment of psychotic break or complete dissociation from reality. She had acted from a place of profound, unaddressed despair. Christina Riggs was born on February 28, 1971. She grew up in a household marked by difficulty, and accounts of her early life describe significant emotional hardship. As an adult, she worked as a nurse, a profession defined by care, by attention to the suffering of others, by an orientation toward healing. She had 2 children from different relationships: Justin, who was 5 years old in November 1997, and Shelby, who was 2. She was a single mother, financially stretched, emotionally exhausted, and according to the mental health testimony presented at her trial, deeply, dangerously depressed. She had sought treatment for depression. She had spoken to people in her life about feeling overwhelmed. The support she needed did not reach her in time. On the night of November 4th, 1997, Christina Riggs administered injections of potassium chloride and morphine to both of her children, and then suffocated them. She then attempted to take her own life with an overdose of medication. The attempt failed. A neighbor became concerned and contacted authorities. When police arrived, they found the children and their mother. Christina Riggs survived. Her children did not. At trial, the picture that emerged was one of a woman who had genuinely believed in the depths of a depression that had gone inadequately treated, that she was sparing her children from a life of suffering, and that she would be with them in death. Mental health professionals testified to the severity of her depressive illness and to the distorted thinking that serious depression can produce. The defense argued that Christina Riggs had been failed by a mental health system that had not provided adequate intervention, and that her actions, however tragic, needed to be understood in the context of a catastrophic mental health crisis. The prosecution argued that the planning involved in obtaining and administering the injections demonstrated premeditation, and that the law required accountability regardless of the psychological context. Christina Riggs was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. In the period following her conviction, she waived her appeals. She stated publicly that she did not want to continue living without her children, that she believed her execution would allow her to be reunited with them, and that she accepted her sentence. Advocates and mental health professionals argued that a person in the grip of severe depression waiving appeals was itself a manifestation of illness and should not be treated as a competent legal decision. The courts ultimately allowed the process to proceed. On May 2, 2000, Christina Riggs was executed by lethal injection at the Cummins Unit in Grady, Arkansas. She was 28 years old, the youngest woman executed in the United States since 1944. Her final statement was brief. She addressed her children directly, saying she was coming to them. She said she loved them, then she was gone. The case of Christina Riggs does not resolve into a narrative of evil. It resolves into something harder and more uncomfortable. A story about what happens when human suffering goes unmet, when the systems meant to catch people in free fall fail, and when the irreversible rushes in to fill the space where help should have been. From Arkansas, we move to Texas, to another mother, another family, and another set of insurance policies that tell their own grim story about what was valued and what was not. Case 9. Francis Newton. 3 shots, 1 policy, many questions. In the annals of Texas capital cases, the name Francis Newton does not always appear at the top of the list. She did not have a high-profile attorney. She did not attract celebrity advocates. Her case did not generate the same volume of national headlines as some others. But among legal scholars, wrongful conviction researchers, and death penalty opponents, her name is spoken with a particular kind of gravity because the case against her, while sufficient to convince a jury, rested on evidence that multiple experts would later characterize as forensically problematic. And because Francis Newton, from the moment of her arrest to the moment of her death, maintained that she had not killed her family. Francis Newton was born on April 16, 1965, in Houston, Texas. By 1987, she was 21 years old, married to a man named Adrian Newton, and the mother of 2 children, Alton, age 7, and Farah, age 21 months. The family lived in a house on Crane Street in Houston. On the evening of April 7, 1987, Francis Newton left the house, telling family members she was going to a neighbor's home. When she returned, she found her husband and both children had been shot. She called for help. Emergency responders arrived to find 3 members of the Newton family dead inside the home. Investigators quickly focused on Francis Newton. They discovered that she had taken out life insurance policies on her husband and children in the weeks before the shootings, with herself as the named beneficiary. They also found gunshot residue on a bag she had left at her sister's home, and a gun was recovered that ballistics testing connected to the case. Prosecutors argued that Francis Newton had killed her family to collect the insurance money and to be free to pursue a relationship with another man. She was tried, convicted of capital murder, and sentenced to death. The case never sat entirely comfortably with those who examined it closely. The gunshot residue evidence was contested. Experts retained by the defense later argued that the testing methodology used was unreliable and that the residue could have been transferred or explained in other ways. The ballistics evidence was also challenged. The life insurance policies, while damning in their timing, did not by themselves prove anything. Francis Newton's attorneys in the years following her conviction argued that the original defense had been inadequate, that exculpatory evidence had not been properly investigated, and that the cumulative effect of these failures had denied her a fair trial. Multiple requests for DNA testing and further forensic examination were filed and denied. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles twice declined to recommend clemency. Governor Rick Perry declined to grant a reprieve. On September 14, 2005, Francis Newton was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She was 40 years old. She was the first black woman executed in Texas since the Civil War era, and the first woman executed in Texas in nearly 22 years. In her final statement, she maintained her innocence. She said she forgave the people who had brought her to that moment and that she was at peace. She said she would wait for her children on the other side. Whether Francis Newton was guilty of the crime for which she was executed is a question that the legal system answered definitively, and that a significant number of researchers and advocates continue to regard as unresolved. What is not in question is that 3 members of a family died in a house in Houston on an April evening in 1987, and that the truth of what happened that night may be more complicated than any verdict can contain. Our final case brings us to a woman whose guilt was never seriously in dispute, a woman whose crimes stretched across years and victims, and whose story, when it was finally told in full, earned her a nickname that has followed her into history. Case D. Judy Buenoano. The Black Widow of Florida. There is a species of spider that kills its mate after reproduction. The name given to it has, over time, migrated into the human lexicon as a label for a particular type of person, one who draws others close, allows them to believe they are loved, and then destroys them. It is not a flattering label. It is not meant to be. And when investigators in Florida began to piece together the full scope of what Judius Welty, who had changed her name to Judy Buenoano, had done to the men and the child in her life, they found that the label fit with a precision that was almost clinical. Judy Buenoano was born Judius Anna Lou Welty on April 4, 1943, in Quanah, Texas. Her early life was defined by hardship and instability. Her mother died when she was 4 years old, and her subsequent upbringing under the care of her father and stepmother was, by her own account and the accounts of those who investigated her background, severely abusive. She was reportedly burned, malnourished, and treated with a cruelty that left deep marks. She dropped out of school in her early teens, had a child at 16, and spent time in a juvenile facility in New Mexico, following a conviction for assault. She later trained as a nurse's aide and moved to Florida, where she built a life that looked, from the outside, like a story of determination and self-reinvention. Her first documented victim was a man named James Goodyear, an Air Force sergeant she had married. Goodyear became seriously ill in 1970 and died in December of that year. His death was attributed to natural causes, and Judy Buenoano collected on his life insurance. A second partner, Bobby Joe Morris, became ill and died in 1978 in Trinidad, Colorado. His death, too, was initially attributed to natural causes. In both cases, post-mortem testing conducted years later would reveal the presence of arsenic. Then there was Michael Buenoano, Judy's son, born before her marriage to James Goodyear and given Goodyear's surname. Michael had joined the army and, by 1980, was 19 years old and in poor health. He had developed a mysterious progressive weakness that had not been adequately diagnosed. In May 1980, Michael Buenoano and his mother went on a canoe trip on the East River in Florida. The canoe capsized. Michael, whose arms and legs had been fitted with heavy leg braces due to his deteriorating condition, sank and drowned. His mother survived. Investigators would later determine that Michael had been insured for $100,000. Toxicological testing after his death was eventually ordered and revealed arsenic poisoning, suggesting that the mysterious illness that had weakened him had been deliberately induced. In 1983, Judy Buenoano became engaged to a businessman named John Gentry. In June of that year, his car exploded when he turned the ignition key. He survived, but the investigation into the explosion led detectives back to Judy Buenoano. They began to look more carefully at the deaths that had surrounded her over the years. The bodies of James Goodyear and Bobby Joe Morris were exhumed and tested. Arsenic was found in both. The accumulation of evidence, the insurance policies, the arsenic, the drowned son, the car bomb produced a picture of sustained and premeditated harm spanning more than a decade. Judy Buenoano was tried first for the attempted murder of John Gentry and convicted. She was then tried for the first-degree murder of her son Michael and convicted, receiving a death sentence. She was not tried for the deaths of Goodyear or Morris, though those deaths informed the broader picture prosecutors presented. During her years on death row in Florida, she maintained that she was innocent of her son's murder. She did not succeed in convincing the courts. On March 30th, 1998, Judy Buenoano was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison in Stark, Florida. She was 54 years old and became the first woman executed in Florida since 1948. Her final statement was brief. She said she had no last words. Then, whether by design or simply by running out of anything left to say, she kept that promise. The chair was activated at 10:08 in the morning. What runs through all 10 of these cases, from Teresa Lewis in Virginia to Judy Buenoano in Florida, from Ruth Snyder in 1928 to Lisa Montgomery in 2021, is not a single thread, but a web of them. Desperation, calculation, grief, delusion, survival, and the irreversible weight of a single terrible decision. The law treats each of these women as an individual case, as it must. But taken together, they form something larger, a portrait of human nature at its most extreme, in circumstances that most of us will never face, making choices that none of us can fully comprehend from the outside. Whether justice was perfectly served in each of these 10 cases is a question reasonable people continue to debate. That 10 families were destroyed, and that 10 more families were left behind to carry the wreckage, is not real crimes, untold secrets, unfiltered truth. Subscribe to our channel, it's completely free, because some stories were never meant to stay buried. Help us grow and bring you more powerful documentaries just like this one.